Hey everyone, welcome back to the React in-depth series. In this video, we're going to go over custom hooks together. I'm super excited for this one. This is kind of a long time coming. We needed to know a lot about how the regular hooks work before we actually could even look at making custom hooks. I remember when I first thought of this idea of custom hooks and I saw them being used in React, I was really intimidated. It just sounded really scary and like, oh, like I barely can get kind of the hooks. How am I supposed to do custom hooks? That sounds kind of intense. So I hope to make this video to make that a little bit more accessible and easier to understand, because really, if you can understand the core base hooks that come with React, things like useState, useEffect, useRef, useReducer, useContext. I think those are all the main ones that we went through. If you're comfortable with those, custom hooks actually are not a really far stretch or too much more of an addition beyond those. So that said though, make sure that you are comfortable with those hooks that I just mentioned, because this idea of custom hooks really just uses those concepts and builds on top of them in order to customize their behavior, as the name kind of implies. So without further ado, let's take a look at how custom hooks work in React together. Okay, so to start, again, just another overview, just so we're all on the same page and we know what we're trying to build together, so it makes sense when you would use these. Custom hooks are really a way for us to share logic between components, okay? And the core part of this is this idea of using this idea of the hooks, right? And we saw that, and I'll show you a visual in a second, which are things like when a component mounts, or when it re-renders, or when certain types of events happen in our components in React specifically, we have a way to kind of react to them, as the name React implies. And React gives us things like useState and the fancier versions like useReducer to actually work with those. And we can use things like useEffects to manage the side effects of things that happen inside our components. So these hooks allow us to hook into the React lifecycles ourselves, very similar to using those base hooks, but we can actually customize their behavior to actually do exactly what we need for our particular application. So the way to think about this is really, it allows us to do things like reduce, reuse, and not recycle, I guess recycle, but just like functions, okay? And when I say reduce here, I just mean reduce the amount of code that we need to write, not like a reducer function. So we're reducing the amount of code, we're reusing the amount of code across our different components and our project, very similar to how you create a reusable function to use in different places if you find yourself kind of copying and pasting things around. Very similar idea for custom hooks, but the main premise is that the difference between a function and a custom hook in React is just that the custom hook is just a function that relies on hooking into the lifecycle behind the scenes so that we can actually have access to reactive elements inside of our components. All right, so that said, let's see what that actually means visually. So we've seen this picture before in our previous videos together. And if you haven't seen this before, this is very useful. Hopefully this makes sense for you to kind of visualize this idea of the React component lifecycle. So we know that all components kind of go through this initialization step. Then the most important ones that we're kind of working with most of the time in React are things like mounting a component into the DOM, updating that component and re-rendering it. And then finally, when we do not need that component anymore, unmounting it. So this might be things like unsubscribing from different types of effects and things like that in our useEffects, for example. So it's really critical that you're comfortable with this idea of this lifecycle, because what a custom hook allows us to do is hook into, as I kind of visualize here, this lifecycle to actually get logic hooked into and running during certain conditions of our components and even across different components. So you want to make sure that this idea makes sense to you and you're comfortable with this idea of the component lifecycle from start to end. Okay, so to start, I want to show you kind of the like the mental model you probably want to have when you're thinking about custom hooks. And this is something I found that very much helped me when I first started learning this stuff a while back. So if you think about useEffect in a component, so just focus on this part as we kind of go through this to start. We have a component here, a function home, and it's returning an h1. Okay, so there's nothing really too special there. We could put a useEffect in here, and I've left out the imports and the exports and all that stuff so we can really focus on the core code. So just assume these are imported for this video. So this useEffect is simply going to console log out that this home component has mounted in the DOM. And we know that because this is an empty dependency array with a useEffect, which means it'll only run one time when this component mounts. And if it's in dev mode, it'll run 2 times just for checking the cleanups. But for all purposes that we need to do, it's going to run 1 time when the component actually mounts. Now, if you think about this, imagine for a second, just imagine a scenario where, for whatever reason, let's just say that I wanted to know when every single component in my tree of React components mounts, just for fun. And I want to log that out. All right. Now, that is possible by basically taking this and we can copy and paste it into every single component. And maybe we can change the name, for example, and then that would work. That would be fine. Right. Now, you've probably kind of hopefully gotten attuned to this idea of like, if we start doing things like this, where we're copying and pasting a bunch of times, like maybe there's a better way, right? Because imagine that we want to change the message. If we want to do that and we had this littered about our code base of maybe like even dozens of components, that would take a while to actually change. Maybe we'd miss it in a few places and that would cause some bugs if this was more than just console logging. So we really would want one place to make sure that we can have the logic for whatever it is that we're trying to do, in this case, log that it's mounted, and we can just use it anywhere else. And we know that this works in JavaScript because we have functions and we reuse functions across different parts of our files, and we can import and export them. And we only have to change the body of that function, the actual logic and the code in that function, 1 time, and everything using that function immediately gets updated. That's one of the beautiful things about functions and using them in our code. So wouldn't it be nice, in theory, if we could have something like this? Right? Like imagine that we could just create a function and it would be called logOnMount in this case, a pretty nice name. Maybe it even takes an argument, but just to keep it simple for now, just no arguments, logOnMount, and it's simply just going to log that this component has mounted. Okay, something like that. And now what we could do is we would just import that wherever we need to use it, and we could just call that function, just like any other function. And if we need to change what's being logged out, or we had to do some other kind of logic in there, or even this, like any string manipulation, we could do that in one place inside that file where we're actually defining that function. We don't have to do it in every single component. And I'm really spending some time kind of harping on this because that's really the whole premise of custom hooks for the most part, right? It's just a way to extract our logic into a centralized place like a function. And then it also happens to be using stateful logic, for example, useEffects and useState, and potentially even things like useReducer, which is just another abstraction on top of useState, as we've seen before. So we could do basically this, right? Which is we could define a function. And this function could be called, for example, logOnMount. We'll change that name in a second, and I'll explain why. And maybe we could define it in the same file, or we could define it in another file, right? In this case, I added the argument, so we could probably pass it home. In this case, I actually realized I forgot to pass it home here, but we'll test this out in code in a second. So this would just return undefined as mounted, but that's okay. Now imagine, regardless of which file this is in, now we can just call that function in our component and it should just work the exact same. Now, this feels really strange the first time you do it, right? Because this feels, maybe it's just me, but maybe you feel this too, right? This useEffect, you're probably thinking, how can I just have like a useEffect just hanging out by itself in a function? Like that just feels kind of wrong, because everything that we've been doing so far has been using these in the context of the JSX that's actually being manipulated through stateful values. But really, if you think about this, all this is really doing is kind of like copying and pasting this code out here, and we're just giving it a name. So this code, this useEffect, is still running inside of this home component. It's not kind of running by itself in the ether. Okay, so it's still in the context of the initialization, the mount, the updating, and the unmount of home in this particular case. Okay, so let's take a look at what this looks like in the actual code, and we'll play around with some things and we'll see it in action together. So I'll switch over to my VS Code over here. I have a project folder open. I'm just going to run npm create. I'll do vt at latest, to create a new React project here. And I'll call this custom-hooks. And I'll use React, I'll use JavaScript, I'll cd to my custom hooks over here, and I'll run npm install. So while that's installing, I'll open up my custom hooks, open up my source, I'll open up my main and my app. And inside of my main, what I'll do is I'll just get rid of that CSS, since I'm really not a fan of just having random CSS in there. I want to be able to control what I have in there. I could probably change that, but I'll leave that out. And I will also, actually I don't need app. You know what I'll do is I'll create a new file. And I'll call it the same thing as what I had over here, right? So I called this logOnMount, and I'll just create a totally new file that's going to use this function, just so we can see how that would actually work. So I'm going to create useLogOnMount. I'll just do camel case.jsx inside of my source folder. Okay, useLogOnMount. My install is done here. I'm just going to run npm run dev, so I can grab that dev server name right there, copy, and I'll just close this off so that we don't have to look at that. I'll go over to my Chrome. I'll make sure that it actually loads properly, and it does. I'll open up my terminal here, and I'll get everything ready with my console, and I'll just zoom in a bit for us, just so it's a bit more clear. Great. Now in here, I'm going to call a function called useLogOnMount, and I'll make sure to export to this function. Export default useLogOnMount. Now, what I want this function to do is run an effect when this is used on mount, as the name kind of implies. So I need to pull in useEffect. So I'm going to make sure I import that. And I'm going to run useEffect. And this is going to be an on-mount effect. And we know that in order to do that, we give it a empty dependency array. And for now, I'll just do it generically, and I'll add an argument, and I'll show you how that works in a second. I'll just do a console log, and I'll say component has mounted. Exclamation. Because who doesn't like exclamation points? There we go. So there we go, right? So this looks kind of weird. But the way to think about this, the way that mentally I would think about this function is, actually, I would just say logOnMount. I got ahead of myself here. I'm going to call this logOnMount. And then I'll show you why I'm calling it use later. I got ahead of myself. I'll just change log right there. Great, I got too excited. logOnMount, okay? So the way I want to mentally think about this is, like, quite literally, anywhere I call this function is just going to, you can think of it literally copying and pasting this code into that spot, okay? So for example, let's go to app over here, and I'm going to get rid of all of this stuff inside of app. I'll get rid of, like, literally everything inside of app, and all I will do inside of app is just return, let's just say an h1, and that's just going to say app. Okay, a very simple React function here, or component, I should say. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to import my logOnMount. I have the file name is useLogOnMount, so excuse that while that's there. You can change it for now, or because we're going to change it to this later, so I'll just leave that for now. Sorry if that is a bit confusing. It doesn't actually matter what you call it until I'll show you why in a second. But let's stick with logOnMount. And now what I can do is I can just call this function here, logOnMount. Now, what this is doing is you can think of it as like copying and pasting the useEffect into this spot. Okay, so like it's basically doing all of this stuff. It's copying and pasting this right into this spot. Okay, so let's switch back here, and I'm going to refresh the page, and let's see what we get. So we actually get our log, right? And since this is running in dev mode, we've seen this before, we get two different logs just because we're checking to see if our effects are cleaned up, but we do get our component has mounted, and that's coming from our useLogOnMount line 5 JSX, which is indeed exactly where this is happening, at least in my code right here, line 5. So that's pretty nice. So if I did this twice, let's see what happens, right? Can I do this twice? What does this mean? I want you to think for a second, what is this going to do? So if I save that and I come back here and I refresh the page, we will see that I get that logged twice, as you would imagine, right? And so that makes sense. Let's clean this up a little bit, and let's make it so that I can add a logOnMount. Maybe it takes a name. And instead of just saying component here, what I can do is I'll change this to be a template string, just so it's a bit nicer. And I can say, for example, name. And if name doesn't exist, then I'll just say component, just like that. So we can use name or we can use component. And what that's going to allow me to do is over here, I can say, in this case, I'll just do home, and then I'll leave it out for the second one so we can see the default condition. Or in this case, it's app actually, not home. So I'll save that. And I want you to think for a second, with what we just added, what are we going to see logged out to the console? All right, so I'll switch back here. I'll refresh the page. And we get app has mounted, component has mounted, and twice again because of the cleanup running there and the dev mode, but that is exactly what we would expect to see. So that's pretty nice, right? This allows us to copy and paste stuff everywhere across our components. Imagine I use this now in like dozens of different components. I could easily do that and change the behavior slightly for what I'm passing in as a name, and it would work as intended. And if I do want to fix anything, I would just have to come to this component to fix it, just like you would any other function. Okay, now I want to kind of switch to this slide, which is the exact same slide as I had before, and this is where I was getting ahead. Hooks in React generally start with the word use in lowercase. So just like this, right? So things like useEffect, useState, useReducer, etc., are all hooks. And React uses this idea of things that start with use that are functions inside of components as like this is a hook. Is this necessary? Absolutely not, because we just saw that it's not necessary with what we just wrote together. This helps other tools like linters and some other tools inside of React so that it knows that this is probably a hook and to treat it kind of like a hook so it can help you out with certain types of debugging and developing. So the only change really I would suggest we do here is what I had before, which is we change this to use logOnMount, just like that. And then I would change this here to use logOnMount and then make import to use logOnMount as well. Everything else is the same. There's literally no functional difference, just the naming convention is different. Also, I would say that this really helps other developers, including yourself in the future, because what this is going to allow you to do is like, oh, you're going to come to this code and you'll say, oh, use something. Okay, that's probably a hook. This is doing something to do with maybe a useState or a useEffect or a useReducer or something like that. And if I am having trouble with the life cycle of this component and there's some bugs, I can maybe look in here to see if that's causing any potential issues because that's doing something on that life cycle. All right, hopefully that one makes sense. So where's practical examples of this? So we're gonna get into exercises in the next video together as we usually do. And I have some quite doozy ones in there that are gonna be pretty tricky to go through. So I encourage you to check those out when we get to that video. But I'll just show you another relatively simple example that's pretty interesting and very useful to see how this actually works. So I wanna show you this function. We're going to go really slow with this just so that it makes sense, because if you can understand how this works, it's really going to push your understanding of how custom hooks works, and you're going to feel very comfortable actually writing these more and more, and the exercises will just kind of add more practice for you. So let's say that we're going to create a function called useTimer. Imagine that my goal is to make a stateful timer for my components to use, which means that it's going to re-render the DOM and show an updated time very similar to a stopwatch. Okay, so in this case, we'll keep it simple and we'll just deal with seconds. What we would normally do inside of a React component is we would use state and use effect and run some kind of interval depending on how many milliseconds or seconds have passed for that kind of timer, and we'd put that state inside of our JSX. Now, what we're going to do in a hook is usually hooks don't return JSX because that's what components do. Hooks return stateful values that you can use inside your JSX, okay, in a reusable fashion. So let's walk through this code together. We're going to create a state up here, and we'll write this in code together to actually see it and play around with it to make sure it really makes sense. It's going to start at the number 0, and we're going to call it timer, and we're going to have the setState function, and we're going to call that setTimer. We're also going to make a useEffect. That's this code right here. This is going to run on mount because it only has an empty dependency array. It has a cleanup function to clean up an interval, it looks like, and it's setting an interval that's going to run every single second. And what is that going to do? It's going to call our setState function, which is setTimer. It's going to take the previous state and add 1 to it. this is going to take this timer right here and change it from 0 to 1, then 1 to 2, 2 to 3, etc., while this component is alive and in the DOM or mounted in the DOM until we get rid of it or unmount it, at which point we're going to run the clear interval. So it looks like this is just going to count this timer up in a stateful manner, which means that any component that uses this hook is going to have access to this stateful value because that's what we are returning from this function. Okay, so we are returning the actual stateful value itself that's changing every single second. Notice we're not returning the setState function because I want the consumer of this hook not to have to worry about the complicated, like all this kind of stuff right here. I don't want to do that in whatever function is using this or component is using this. I just want to be like, I want to use a timer, and let's just assume for now we know it's in seconds. I want it to just start counting up. Just give me a timer so I can statefully put that inside my component. Okay, so let's take a look at how this actually works. So I'm going to switch over to VS Code. I'll create a new file. I'll call this useTimer.jsx. And in this file, I'll create a function. Again, starting with use because that's what helps React and our linters and some other tools. I'll call this export default useTimer. You can default export it, or you can export it as a named export in this case, since it's not really a component. So it's up to you. I'll just do it as a default export. I'll do useState as an import here, as well as useEffect. Okay. So we're going to say const, and I'll do timer set timer is equal to useState. And this is going to start our timer at 0. And then I'm going to run a useEffect. And our effect is just going to run on mount because it's going to be an interval. And we are going to create an interval that runs every single second in this case, just by default. So I'm going to say const id equals set interval. Interval takes the function to run and then the amount of time after which to repeat it. In this case, 1000 milliseconds. I'm going to run this function after every single 1000 milliseconds. And I also want to make sure I clean up this function. So I'm going to say return the cleanup function in this case, which is remove interval, or not remove interval, clear interval, remove event listener, or clear interval of my ID that I get back from my set interval, right? So this returns a number, which is the ID for that interval to clear from our browser, and then we can return the callback to actually clear that off. Great. So in here, what am I going to do? Well, I'm going to set timer. I can do timer +1, or I can just use this syntax previous pre +1, just so that we have access to the timer. And I'll show you what happens with both ways, actually, because I think there'll be a bug if I use timer +1. I believe I'll double check. The intervals are always a bit wonky in the use effects with the closures. And I want to make sure I return the timer here. Now, we are returning the stateful value of timer. Okay, that is this value right here, which is the actual state that's coming back from useState, and we are calling the setState over here in the interval. So we're not interested in that. We just want our component not to have to worry about that. All right, so I'm going to switch back to my app.jsx here, and I'm going to import my useTimer from useTimer.jsx. And the way that I use this now is just like this. I'll say const timer is equal to useTimer. That's it. Done. Right? What is this doing? Let's think about this for a second. I am calling a function called useTimer. That is this function right here. I'm grabbing the return value of that and I'm shoving it in a variable called timer. What's the return value? Well, we just said the return value is the stateful value of this timer. It just happens that I'm calling it the same thing, but we could call this whatever we want, call it time or seconds or whatever. Okay. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to put that as a stateful value in my actual JSX. So let me just do this really quick. Oh my, move this up in here. And I can put my timer now. I'll put my timer in my paragraph tag. Why not? And I will put my timer just like that. Okay. So this is evaluating this variable, which is going to be coming from our hook, which is basically copying and pasting all of this into our app. And that's going to be using both state and an effect. Notice we didn't import state and effect in here, just the actual hook. And that's all that we have to worry about. Now, if I switch back to here, we can see it's been running for a few seconds. If I reload the page, we can actually see that that indeed is counting up. Look at that. Isn't that pretty awesome? Right? It's re-rendering the DOM for that component and that section every single time the state changes. So if I pull up this paragraph tag, we can see that in the Elements tab, it indeed is actually always re-rendering in that spot automatically because that's what state does. So that's pretty nice. Before I show you another visual to help this out a bit, I'm going to just show you, I believe, the bug that I was trying to talk about, which is if I do timer +1 here, specifically with a set interval, I think that's going to cause a bug. Yeah, so we only have 1 and it's always going to be stuck at 1. And the reason for that is that because of closure and the way that set interval actually runs, it's actually getting a snapshot of the old timer and always using that timer. So it's always going to be like, for example, if I show you console.log of the timer here, it's always going to be, well, it's going to be 0 and then it's going to be 1 forever. So if I refresh the page, it's going to be 0. Well, actually, it's going to be 0 and then it's going to do 0 + 1 forever. So it's always going to be 0 because that's what it starts off as, and that's the closure is going to be captured here with the event loop, the way that set interval runs on the actual event loop. So it's a bit more advanced, and we kind of covered this as to why we want to be using the syntax for kind of this previous and then previous +1 before a little bit, just so that we can avoid situations like this and other situations where we're calling multiple set states in a row within one component re-render loop, for example. So don't get too carried away with this part. Just know that there is an issue with how this is running if we don't use a callback function to actually grab the updated version of that state. And this is only for a set interval in this case, or set timeout as well. Okay, so that works for us. Look at that. That's actually counting up. That's pretty beautiful. That's quite nice. Now, this component, just to recap this, like, it doesn't need to know about how this works internally. That's the entire point of this hook, right? We can just use the hook, and as long as we coded it properly, this is just going to work. And that's the nice thing about these hooks. This unlocks quite a lot of power. And this is exactly how every single hook that's a custom hook, that's a third-party hook that's built into React works behind the scenes. It just uses a function that hooks into different lifecycle methods, like in this case, useState and useEffect. And it exposes the very simple results of that so that we can use it in our component without having to worry about the internal logic of that. Of course, if you're building your own hook, you're just going to have to write that logic the first time and test it. And then once that's actually working well, then you can reuse it across your whole application. Your other team members can actually use it as well, which is quite nice. So let me kind of come back here and show you kind of exactly what's happening, just so you can visualize this a little bit better. Because I really like to focus on kind of the visuals and the copying and pasting idea, because it always helped me understand this, and I hope it helps you as well. If it doesn't, I'm sorry. Hopefully everything else helped you a little bit, but hopefully this does help a little bit. So the way to think about this is that literally when we're calling useTimer in our component, in this case, it's home, but it was just app right now, we are basically copying and pasting this into this spot right here. Okay, so we are like effectively copying and pasting this part right here, the state and the effect, into this spot right here. Like the useState and the useEffect are going to go right here. Okay, and they're going to run in the lifecycle of app specifically. Okay, so that is the way to think about this. Now, one caveat with this is that if you're using state like this across multiple components, the same hook across multiple components, each of them is going to have their own lifecycle, which means they're all going to have their own independent state and their own independent useEffect. Unless this is being shared in a fancy way through like context
or like some kind of fancy reducer or something like that, or use ref, by default, everything is just, it's an independent copy of each other. They're not like, if I was to use timer in another component, okay, it would be its own timer and it could have its own timing. Okay, so just to show you exactly what I mean by that really quick, I'm going to create an argument I can pass to timer, which is start time, and I'll default it at 0. Okay, and I'll just pass that here as a useState. So I can pass any start time that I want. Okay, and inside of app, I'm gonna pass nothing, which means it's gonna start at 0. What I'm going to then do is I'll create another file, and I'll call this, I'll just call this mytimer.jsx. I'll make a quick function here, mytimer. This is going to be export default mytimer. And we're going to return in here. I'll just put a little heading just so that we can see it. I'll put it in h2 mytimer. And I'm going to import that hook. Okay, which was useTimer. That's all I'm going to use. I'm going to make sure I add the extension here. And I'm going to say const, I'll just call something different, just so it's super obvious. Seconds is equal to useTimer. I'm going to start this timer at a different number. Okay, I'll start at 100, just for fun. Okay, and I'm going to put that right here. I'm going to put seconds right over here. Now this component, I'm going to put right below this other timer right here. So I'm going to import, what did I call it? mytimer.jsx, and I'm going to put that right over here. This is going to be mytimer. All right. Now, I want you to think for a second, what are we going to see in the DOM for these two hook states and their timers? This one is using the default timer starting at 0. And this one is passing in a useTimer of 100, and they're both going to be rendered one on top of the other. All right, you ready? Let's take a look. I'll switch back to Chrome. I'll refresh the page, and we can see that this one starts at the 0 that we expect, and this one starts at the 100 and counts up from there as we expect. And we can see that we're getting their closed over values of their initial state as well on the side from our log. So this shows that even though we're using the exact same hook, right? This hook right here is the exact same hook that we're using right here. They each have their own independent version of state and their own independent useEffect that is not tied together. So that's very important to distinguish. There are fancy tricks, like I said, that you can use context and refs and all that kind of stuff to make that work slightly differently depending on what type of application you're building. But most of the time, this is the way that you'll see things be used because we do want things to be stateful independently. That's kind of most of the point of storing state. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. So to recap this video, I would like to kind of go over what this idea of hooks really helps us to do when we're writing our own custom versions. So we can return reusable stateful data, which we just saw. We can also have reusable effects, which we just saw as well. Most libraries use these to create reactive hooks for us to use. For example, there's like data fetching libraries like useQuery, use SWR. There's like React Router. There's all these different types of hooks that we can pull in. I guess React Router is like a component, but there's many different hooks like form hooks and things like that that allow us to abstract away the logic that the library authors and the authors of those frameworks or libraries can abstract away a lot of that hook logic, the what's running the useEffect, or if there's a reducer involved, or if it's set state, or what context they're using, all that kind of stuff we don't have to worry about. We can just say like, use timer or use stopwatch or, use query, for example, right? And we can just worry about the actual logic that we need to for our application. And we can even reuse that hook across different components. So we can create our own, or when we do create our own, you're usually going to be creating your own because you're seeing lots of duplicated code or state or logic across your different components. So if we were basically doing this, repeatedly throughout our different components, or even our logger, for example. If you're doing this kind of thing and you're just copying and pasting across different components, maybe, not always, but maybe it makes sense to just extract that into a hook so that you can just have it in one place, just like you would any other function that you end up refactoring. So this is really a great abstraction tool. As the third-party libraries kind of illustrate, we don't need to worry about any of the internal workings of the lifecycle and the logic for these hooks to actually make use of them. We can just rely on the stateful values that get passed back, or whatever internal logic is working to get the job done, and focus on building our actual components that we need for our own application. So there you have it. That is custom hooks. We're going to get a lot more practice in the next set of videos with a bunch of exercises. If you did like this video and it was useful to you, I would love it if you could like the video and subscribe to the channel. I'd love to hear in the comments, have you used custom hooks before? Which ones have you used that you found quite valuable? Maybe we can share them with other folks that are watching as well. So as I mentioned, what we're going to do in the next video is go through a bunch of exercises. I have some quite tricky ones in there, for example, like some caching with querying, and some logging and stateful ones as well. So I'm excited to get to those. As well, if you did like the content and you do want to support further, I have a Patreon set up, so you can check that out, or you can support through YouTube memberships or the super thanks as well. So thanks again for watching. I will see you in the exercise videos for custom hooks. See you later.